So I debated on making this video because this has nothing to do with books, really. It just has some things to do like with some of the things that of course I've had in my mind. And recently, as soon as today, I found out that somebody I used to hang out with a lot passed away. And it's always a really hard thing when you learn about those kinds of things, especially because I was going through a really hard time, and him and his girlfriend were very kind to me and they were very good to me, and they really helped me get through it. And it's been a long time since we've spent any time together. And so like it wasn't one of those friendships like where we saw each other all the time and we talked all the time, but I thought about him all the time. And they're just really good friends, you know? And I think what makes me the saddest is that it always feels too soon when somebody is taken from you. You never feel like you have enough time. Like you could have all the time in the world and it still wouldn't be enough time. It's not an easy thing, you know, losing someone. Doesn't matter how close you were at the time they were gone, because if they brought you any kind of comfort or joy or anything like that, it just feels like them passing away is like a light getting put out, and the world's just a little bit less bright today. This kind of stirred up a lot for me. Of course, my battery dies right in the middle of this. This happening today kind of stirred up not just the fact that he was gone. It stirred up a lot of memories. It's kind of triggering. Back in 2011, I lost a couple people that were really close to me. And a few years before that, I lost someone else, and I've lost a lot of people, and I'm not looking for sympathy because that's not what this is about. I'm hoping that wherever you are, if you are experiencing grief, this might actually help you or be of some sort of comfort to you, or kind of give maybe some of your emotions a voice or something like to that effect. This is not for sympathy. Like, I don't want any of that. What this is for is kind of just some of my thoughts, along with the triggers like that losing somebody else has kind of put me through. People expect there to be a timeline. People who don't really feel grief. I feel like grief is a very, very personal experience because everybody deals with grief differently. Some people don't deal with it. Some people just kind of ignore it and they hope that it will go away, and they just kind of live their lives day to day, because we all have to live after this hole has been taken out of us, or at least that's how I feel, you know, every time something like this happens. And we all have to kind of struggle through it. It's very difficult. And people who take a lot longer to get over these kinds of things, especially in my situation, I was very heavily criticized on multiple occasions for still feeling very strongly regarding a loss of somebody that I cared about. And even like years and years and years later, even now, it's still not something that I'm actually over. And it's not the fact that I haven't been living my life, because I've had to figure out how to live my life without that person in my world anymore. It's funny, when you really get close to somebody, when you really start to understand like that this person is a big part of your life, you kind of almost begin to imagine a future where they're in it. And when they aren't in it anymore, it kind of just really upsets an expectation that you had. Because maybe it's not so much of an expectation as it was just a lifelong hope that you'd get more time with that person. I think that grief is something that everyone has experienced at one time or another in different ways. And I don't think that everybody experiences grief the same way or views it the same way. A long time ago when I was seeing an acupuncturist, he mentioned to me that when you watch somebody pass away, you actually watch them transcend and become something more than just riding on this earthly plane. And those weren't the exact words that he used, but they were good enough that it gave me a little bit of peace because I never looked at death as a type of transformation. I want to say it was probably about a good 5 years ago now? It's funny how time goes so fast. I actually was in the room when one of my friends passed away, and it's nothing like what Hollywood depicts. Watching somebody take their last breath. It is very intense, and it's not glamorous, and there's such a finality to it, to that last breath. To know like that person isn't actually trying a breath. And in some ways, if you see that, it does actually finalize the fact that they are gone, and it makes you believe it. Because when you're not present, you're still questioning if, it actually happened. So as terrible as that was to witness, it does give you kind of a finality as well. I think that people who criticize other people for the way they grieve are awful. Or because they grieve long and they grieve hard. There is nothing wrong with feeling. There is nothing wrong with loving that person anymore. There is nothing wrong with being a part of those feelings. And what's even harder to come to terms with is that you feeling happy and you trying to distance yourself a little bit from them does not mean that you've failed them. It just means that you're trying to figure out how to do things without them. It took me a very long time, and I'm still trying to grasp the fact that if I'm allowed to hurt for them, but I can't make my entire life built around that grief, because otherwise I will have spent my entire life building up my grief around that death. And sometimes when you give up on that grief, and when you give up on, trying to navigate grief, and, you haven't failed that person, you haven't given up on them, you're just trying to figure out, how to make it through. And I think for me, that was probably one of the biggest lessons in what grief actually means, because one of my instances of grief, I kind of just sunk myself into it. I was drowning, but I could still breathe underwater. It was just heavy, and I let the feeling of it weigh me down. Because for a little bit longer, I got to feel closer to them. And I think sometimes, letting that kind of stuff weigh you down, it can be very destructive. It was for me, because I was kind of sticking myself in that spot, and I was essentially refusing to move until, hoping that maybe it would make the situation not true anymore, that it would make them miraculously come back from the dead. And so I think that is something that, that a lot of people struggle with. And I don't know, if this is resonating with anyone, or, if I'm just talking, but grief is hard. Grief doesn't somehow get easier with time. You just learn how to deal with it, and you learn how to take one breath after the next, and you learn how to do it in a world where they don't exist anymore. And I think that's the hardest lesson, is learning how to breathe and how to live and how to move on in a world where they don't exist, and where the world feels a little bit less bright. I think most of us have dealt with some sort of grief in our life, and it's never easy, no matter how many times you have to deal with it. And it's never easy, no matter how many times you are faced with it. And it's like the people that are just above my age or near it, it almost feels worse in some ways, because I just can't picture somebody that young passing on. And I feel like they could have had so much more life in them. And I know I can't convince myself of that either, because there's a lot of conflicting feelings when it comes to grief. Because I want to believe that it was just their time. And I think that because there's so many conflicting feelings of grief, that's another reason why the process of grieving itself is such a complex process, and we can never really understand fully what grief means from one person to another. I know grief is something that a lot of us struggle with, and we struggle with it every day, some of us. But I also think it's important to acknowledge the fact that it's okay for us to struggle with it. It's okay for us to love them still. But I think my hardest lesson was not building my life around it. Was being able to get up in the morning and not stake a claim that they were going to come rushing back through the door. I hope this has helped you, and I hope that you got something out of this, and I hope that this narrative that I've shared with you becomes just as much of a part of me as maybe helping to relate to your own experiences with this. And if you guys want to discuss anything, if you guys want to have a conversation about this, you guys can either contact me on one of my other social medias, or you guys can go ahead and kind of talk to me about it in the discussion below. And I'm really open to discussing grief and struggles with this, because I think that we all need a support system for grief. And I think we should all be understanding toward each I can't even speak. I think we should all be understanding towards each other, because I think that's such an important thing. And I think it's such a heavy burden to bear alone. And to know like that we share grief with others is also such a big thing. And to know that we are understood in our grief. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I hope you guys liked it, and I will see you again very soon.